Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. This is how the birth of Jesus Christ came about. When his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found with child through the Holy Spirit. Joseph, her husband, since he was a righteous man, yet unwilling to expose her to shame, decided to divorce her quietly. Such was his intention when, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary, your wife, into your home, for it is through the Holy Spirit that this child has been conceived in her. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel," which means God is with us. When Joseph awoke, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and he took his wife into his home. The Gospel of the Lord.
As I am sure you've heard a number of times, Advent is the time of the liturgical season when in our spiritual lives we focus on expectation, on waiting expectantly for the Lord in our lives. But what are we waiting for? Well, we're waiting for the celebration of Christ's birth at Christmas, of course. We're waiting for our definitive encounter with the Lord at the end of our lives and at the end of time. Certainly these things. But we're also reminded that at Advent, we are a people who wait expectantly for God to enter our lives, often in surprising ways, and for us to respond with faith and generosity. Joseph Tobin, then the Archbishop of Indianapolis, heard a few weeks ago that Pope Francis would name him a cardinal. I had the chance to speak with him that morning, and he had been at St. Mydrad's Abbey and had absolutely no advanced notification that this announcement would be made. It was a surprise to him. He learned about it when everybody started calling him on his cell phone. What's all this about, he wondered. He was dumbfounded that the Pope would want to name him a cardinal. And then a few weeks later, he was asked to leave his beloved diocese of Indianapolis and go to Newark, New Jersey, to lead the diocese there. At the press conference after that second announcement, Cardinal Tobin spoke about how disconcerting the past few weeks have been for him. But he said that his favorite description of faith is a willingness to be surprised by God. a willingness to be surprised by God and to have a heart open to God's surprises. Perhaps the core of the Advent message is that each of us needs hearts open to God's surprises in our lives. We hear about faith and God's surprises in the lives of three individuals in our readings today: King Ahaz, St. Paul, and St. Joseph. King Ahaz was the king of Judah, the southern kingdom of Israel, and his royal city was, of course, Jerusalem. Isaiah the prophet in the reading today confronts King Ahaz as he was checking the preparations to defend Jerusalem against military attack. The situation was that two kingdoms north of Judah had formed an alliance to attack Judah. The word came to King Ahaz in Jerusalem, and he and everyone was terrified. Isaiah writes, "The hearts of the king and the heart of the people trembled, as trees in the forest tremble in the wind." King Ahaz then sent word to the great king of Syria and asked for protection. He said, "I am your servant and your son. Come and rescue me." Ahaz took gold from the temple in Jerusalem to send to the king of Assyria. And that's the context for the prophet Isaiah to come to King Ahaz and say, don't rely on your alliances. Rely on faith in God. As Isaiah says, unless your faith is firm, you and your kingdom will not be firm. And Ahaz, with this sort of false piety, says, no, I'm not going to tempt the Lord. I won't tempt the Lord. I'm too holy for that. But of course, he didn't want a sign from Isaiah and the Lord because he was afraid it would mean he'd have to leave the military alliance that he had thought would bring him safety and comfort and reliance. King Ahaz was afraid that God would in fact give him a sign, and afraid of what the sign God may give him. He relied on his alliances, and his kingdom was eventually overrun. St. Paul, in today's second reading, begins by saying that he is a slave of Christ, set apart from the gospel of God, which he promised previously through his prophets and Holy Scriptures, the gospel about his son Jesus. Paul, as you know, began life as a zealous Jew, zealous in following the law. He was so zealous that he undertook to destroy the people who adopted a new teaching with Jesus as the Messiah. But as he was on the road to persecute those people, God threw him off his horse and blinded him. "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you?" "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Paul was taken to Damascus. His blindness was eventually healed, and he embraced the very gospel he had been persecuting and became its slave to preach it to the Gentiles. What an utter surprise for Paul. He was zealous for the law, righteous in doing God's will, persecuting the Christians because of his righteousness, and God throws him off his horse and says, "Look, I want you to be an apostle of that same gospel." And Paul heard and embraced that call. And then the gospel reading, we hear about St. Joseph, a righteous man, a quiet man, an unostentatious man, a devout man. He was pledged to make Mary his wife when he learned that she was pregnant and not by him. We can only imagine the shock and disappointment for Joseph when he heard that. But he wanted to divorce her quietly so as not to shame her. But the angel comes at night. the angel comes at night and said, Joseph, don't be afraid to take Mary as your spouse. God was asking something from him that he never imagined, never expected. But he simply does what God asks of him, quietly, devoutly, with dedication. This Advent season reminds us that our God is a God of surprises. Unexpected things come into our lives, and we must decide how to respond. We can respond like Ahaz. No, I won't tempt the Lord. I won't ask for a sign. Who was afraid to give up what he relied on, afraid of what God might ask him. Or we might respond like Paul or Joseph, to be thrown off our horse, to be shocked, to be disappointed, and yet find in that a calling to deeper faith and deeper service. God's surprises come in our lives in so many forms, and each one of us in different ways. Perhaps it's a child or a spouse who is ill. Perhaps it's an illness in our own lives. Perhaps it is the breakdown of a relationship. Perhaps it's a disappointment in work. Perhaps it is a responsibility that is so great we're not sure that we can bear it. The question for each of us is, when God surprises us, how will we respond? Will we be like Ahaz, who didn't want to give up the alliances which he thought brought him security? Or will we be like Paul and Joseph, who simply found in that surprise a calling to deeper fidelity and deeper service, who found God's path for them in their lives? You know, true faith is not simply the repetition of abstract doctrines. It is having an Advent heart, an expectant heart that awaits God's surprises. And such a faith finds in the events of our lives, whether expected or unexpected, whether disappointing or encouraging, it finds a calling to deeper faith and service. And in that response, in our response, if we accept it, our faith can be truly alive. As we go on with Mass, let us pray for that Advent faith in this season of expectation and hope.